a hot summer day in Kansas, and you're driving through the city of Wichita. You're delighted as you see the headlight of an approaching train. The train approaches, and you're even more delighted to see that it has a pair of former Southern Pacific SD40M-2 rebuilds, one still wearing its original paint, as the power. As the EMDs rumble past, you speculate to yourself what purpose these units serve. This is the Kansas and Oklahoma Railroad. Stretching over more than 700 miles of track in the state of Kansas, it's no surprise that the K&O has a wide variety of locomotives for railfans to shoot. In this video, I'll be going over the history and current whereabouts of every present-day K&O locomotive. So without further ado, here's the locomotives of the K&O, Kansas's hidden gems. WAMX 3511 was built in 1965 as Western Pacific GP35 number 3019. It originally wore the Western Pacific's iconic silver and orange livery before being repainted into the railroad's dark green and orange livery in 1974. The locomotive was added to the Union Pacific roster in December 1982 following the UP's acquisition of the WP. It was repainted into armor yellow and renumbered to 797. It would work for the UP until 1997 when it was purchased by the then new South Kansas and Oklahoma Railroad. In 2006, it was transferred to the Kansas and Oklahoma Railroad, its current home. The locomotive finally lost the number 797 in 2008 when it was renumbered to WAMX 3511. It is still active on the K&O, and it even wears its Union Pacific paint. Interestingly, this unit is well known for throwing sparks when under intense pressure and has started at least 2 fires in Wichita, Kansas since 2022. WAMX 3520 was built in May of 1964 as Denver and Rio Grande Western 3031. It was originally painted in the Rio Grande's first black and orange scheme, which had Rio Grande on the side in small lettering. It worked a rather uneventful career on the Rio Grande until 1989 when it was assumed into Union Pacific following the UP-DRGW merger. The locomotive would work for the UP into the mid-1990s when it was sold to the Southeast Kansas Railroad. Following the falling of the SEK, the locomotive would be assumed into South Kansas and Oklahoma and painted into the SKOL yellow and black scheme. It was renumbered to 3031 and transferred to the Kansas and Oklahoma Railroad. In 2008, it was renumbered to WAMX 3520, the number it still wears today. The locomotive is believed to be one of the only remaining WAMX locomotives to wear the original SKOL livery. It is still active today. WAMX 3824 was built in March of 1967 as Bangor and Aroostook GP38 number 85. It was originally painted in the BAR's red and gray paint scheme. It served an uneventful career on the B&A, as locals call it, until the late 1990s when the locomotive was repainted into the Bangor and Aroostook's dark blue, gray, and yellow scheme and renumbered to 350. In 2007, the locomotive was sold to Watco, but kept its original number until 2008, when it was renumbered to WAMX 3824. The locomotive served an uneventful career on the K&O until 2014, when it received a formal K&O paint scheme. Unfortunately, the unit is now deadlined. WAMX 3825 and 3826 were built in March of 1969 and December of 1967 as Pennsylvania Reading Sea Shoreline's GP38s in number 2005 and 2004. The locomotives would serve the PRSL uneventfully until 1976 when they were absorbed into Conrail and renumbered to CR 7665 and 7664. I could not find much more information on these units, other than that they were sold to the Bangor and Aroostook as number 93 and 92, but were repainted and renumbered in the 1980s to 353 and 355, along with being rebuilt into GP38Ms. The locomotives were sold to Watco in 2005, although they did retain their original numbers until 2008 when they were given their current numbers 3825 and 3826. In 2014, the locomotives were repainted into the K&O paint scheme. 3825 served the K&O for 4 more years before being transferred to Alabama. Its K&O decals were removed in the process. 2 years later, the locomotive was returned to the K&O. It still serves the K&O today. 3826, however, was transferred off of the K&O in 2023. It currently resides at the Kaw River Railroad/Kansas City Terminal. WAMX 3827 was built in October of 1969 for the Missouri Pacific with an unknown number. Following the MP's absorption into Union Pacific, the unit was sold to Bangor & Aroostook as GP38 number 95. It served the bar until 2001 when it was rebuilt into a GP38M, renumbered to 363, and sold to the Appalachian and Ohio Railroad, retaining its number. It was sold to Watco in 2007 and in 2008 was renumbered to WAMX 3827. In 2014, it was repainted into the K&O paint scheme. It is currently stored on the K&O with an uncertain fate. WAMX 3829 was built in September of 1967 as Bangor & Aroostook GP38 number 86. The locomotive did serve a mostly uneventful career on the BAR, although it was put on long-term lease to Conrail in 1978 and would be leased until the early 1980s. In 2001, it was rebuilt into a GP38M, repainted, and renumbered to BAR 352. Watco purchased the unit in 2005 and placed it into service on the South Kansas and Oklahoma Railroad in Kansas. Interestingly, the completely unpatched BAR 352 led the Pittsburgh, Kansas Little Balkans Days excursion in 2005, a baffling decision by Watco but an interesting one nonetheless. In 2007, the locomotive was repainted at Mid-America Car into the Austin and Western Railroad's white and red livery and transferred there. In 2009, the locomotive would receive an official Watco paint job and would be transferred to Grand Rapids, Michigan to serve on the Grand Elk Railroad. It was given Grand Elk decals there and would serve for the Grand Elk until 2015. That year, the locomotive's Grand Elk decals were removed and it was transferred to the Wisconsin and Southern Railroad. The locomotive would work for the WSOR until 2020, when it suffered an engine failure and fire was moved to the Kansas and Oklahoma Railroad for storage. In 2021, the locomotive was repaired and returned to service on the Kansas and Oklahoma, where it still resides today. It is still active on the K&O. WAMX 3831 was built in October of 1966 for the Missouri Pacific as GP38 number 573. It would serve the MP until the MP's demise under multiple identities, those being MP 573, MP 853, and finally MP 2003. In 1985, the locomotive was sold to Bangor & Aroostook and renumbered to BAR 96. In 1997, the locomotive was rebuilt into a GP38M and renumbered to 356. It would serve the BAR until 2005, when it was purchased by Watco and transferred to the South Kansas and Oklahoma Railroad. In 2007, the locomotive was renumbered to WAMX 3831. It would serve the SKOL until 2014, when it was repainted into the Watco livery and transferred to Alabama. In 2017, it was brought back to Kansas and repainted again into the SKOL livery. In 2020, the locomotive would receive a unique light blue paint job with a dark blue X on the nose and the Colorado flag on the side for the newly formed Colorado Pacific Railroad, which ran the old Missouri Pacific Towner line west from the Kansas border to Pueblo, Colorado. The locomotive would serve the CXR as a crew training unit until 2021, when it suffered severe mechanical failures and was brought back to the SKOL shop at Cherryvale, Kansas for repairs. Following its repairs at Cherryvale, it was brought back to the K&O and would serve in its CXR livery until late 2022, when its CXR decals were removed, leaving it as a simple blue Jeep. It would continue to serve the K&O until May of 2024, when it would suffer from yet another mechanical failure, leaving it deadline. It is still laid up today. WAMX 3832 was built in March of 1966 as Bangor & Aroostook 82. It would wear the railroad's dark blue scheme until the 1970s, when it was repainted into the red and gray. It was rebuilt into a GP38M in 1997. It would serve the BAR until 2005, when it was sold to Watco and transferred to the South Kansas and Oklahoma Railroad. In 2007, it was renumbered to WAMX 3832 and transferred to the Kansas and Oklahoma. It worked in its BAR paint until 2014, when it received the official K&O paint job. It served an uneventful career on the K&O until 2021, when it received a fresh Watco paint job, interestingly without the K&O decals. It still operates on the K&O today. WAMX 3838 was built in March of 1969 as Pennsylvania Reading Sea Shoreline's GP38 number 2006. It would work for the PRSL for 7 years until it was absorbed into Conrail in 1976 and renumbered to 7666. In 1979, the unit was sold by Conrail to the Bangor & Aroostook Railroad as GP38 number 94. It would serve the BAR as a GP38 until 2001, when it was rebuilt into a GP38M and renumbered to 366. It would be sold to Watco in 2005 and transferred to the South Kansas and Oklahoma Railroad. In 2007, the locomotive was renumbered to WAMX 3838 and transferred to the K&O. It would receive an official K&O paint job in 2014, and later a Watco Join Our Team decal in 2021. The unit was laid up in early 2024. WAMX 3873 was built in January of 1964 as Southern Pacific GP35 number 7423 and would later be renumbered to 6535. It was rebuilt by SP into a GP35R in July of 1979 and given a new number, 6338. It would serve the SP faithfully until 1996, when it was absorbed into Union Pacific, repainted into the UP scheme, and then quickly sold off to the Cedar Rapids and Iowa City Railroad, now known as Crandick Rail, as GP35E number 111. The locomotive would later be sold from Crandick Rail to the Birmingham Southern Railroad and renumbered to 711, yet somehow still retaining its UP paint. The locomotive would also be given the Birmingham Terminal Railroad Dragon logo and a final renumbering to WAMX 3873 in 2014. The locomotive would be transferred to the South Kansas and Oklahoma Railroad in 2017 to serve as a road switcher. It worked mostly uneventfully on the SKOL until May of 2018, when it was repainted into the K&O livery and transferred off of the Skull. The unit was also laid up in early 2024. WAMX 3901 was built in May of 1965 for the Southern Pacific as GP35 number 7746. It served an uneventful life on the Southern Pacific until 1978, when it was renumbered to SP 6643. The unit would be sold off in the late 1980s to Burlington Northern and would be rebuilt into a GP39V and given the number 2970. The locomotive would work for the BN, and later BNSF, until 2011 when it was sold to Watco. The locomotive would be sent to the K&O's McPherson and Newton line for service. In late 2012, the locomotive received the Kansas and Oklahoma paint scheme. However, the locomotive would not stay in the K&O forever, as in 2016 it was sent to the Kanawha River Railroad in West Virginia and would receive the Kanawha paint scheme. WAMX 3905 was built in January of 1965 for the Gulf Mobile and Ohio Railroad as GMO GP35 number 626. The locomotive would last into the days of the Illinois Central Gulf until the late 1980s, when it was sold to Burlington Northern and rebuilt into GP39V number 2974. The unit would last into the days of BNSF until 2011, when it was purchased by Watco and sent to the McPherson and Newton line. The unit would be repainted in the fall of 2012 into the Watco paint scheme with K&O decals on the nose. It still serves the K&O today. WAMX 3906 and 3907 were built in January of 1965 as GM&O GP35s number 625 and 624. The locomotives would survive through the ICG merger and would receive the ICG orange, black, and white paint scheme and a renumbering to ICG 2523 and 2522. The units were purged from the ICG in the late 1980s and would be purchased by BN and rebuilt into GP39Vs number 2975 and 2976. They worked for the BNSF under the same road numbers until 2011, when they were purchased by Watco and sent to the Newton line. The units would be repainted in the fall of 2012 into the Watco paint scheme. 3906 was painted into the Watco paint scheme with K&O decals on the nose, and 3907 was painted into the full K&O livery. They still work for K&O today. WAMX 3910 was built in December of 1963 for the Southern Pacific as GP35 number 7409. The unit would be renumbered to SP 6521 in the early 1980s. The unit didn't last much longer on the SP, as in 1989 it was sold to Burlington Northern to be rebuilt into GP39V number 2979. 2979 would work into the days of BNSF until 2011, when Watco purchased it for the K&O Newton line. The unit would receive the Watco paint scheme with K&O decals on the nose in the fall of 2012. It still works for the K&O today, although it has been transferred from the Newton line to the more diverse southern section of the railroad. WAMX 3914 was built in August of 1964 for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad as CB&Q GP35 number 986. The unit survived the 1970 Burlington Northern merger and would be renumbered from CB&Q 986 to BN 2532. It received the BN Cascade Green paint in the mid-1970s. In 1989, the unit's life as a GP35 would come to an end, as it was rebuilt into a GP39E and renumbered to 2914. It worked for BN and later BNSF until 2011, when it was sold to Watco and repainted into the K&O paint scheme. It would work on the Newton line until 2015, when it was moved south. It worked on the K&O until late 2023, when it was transferred to the Louisiana Southern Railroad in Gibbsland, Louisiana. It still resides there today. WAMX 3929 and 3930 were built in April of 1976 for the Delaware and Hudson Railroad as GP39-2s number 7616 and 7617. They would work for the D&H until 1984, when they were sold to Guilford Rail Systems, Boston and Maine, and renumbered to BM 356 and 357. They would work for the Guilford until 1994 when they were purchased by the Union Pacific and renumbered to UP 2735 and 2736. They worked for the UP until the early 2000s when they were renumbered to UP 1235 and 1236. They continued to work for the UP until 2016 when they were purchased by Watco and renumbered to WAMX 3929 and 3930. They both received the full K&O paint job and still work for the K&O today. WAMX 3933 was built in March of 1976 for the Delaware and Hudson as GP39-2 number 7611. It worked for the D&H until 1983 when it was sold to Guilford Rail System and renumbered to BM360. It would be sold off from the Guilford in 1984 to Union Pacific, where it received an unknown number. It was renumbered to 1239 in the early 2000s and served on the UP until 2013 when it was laid up at Roseville, California. Watco got their hands on the unit in 2016 and repainted it into the K&O paint scheme. It still serves the K&O today. WAMX 3936 and 3937 were built in March of 1976 for the Delaware and Hudson as GP39-2s, number 7603 and 7604. D&H would work the units until 1984 when they were sold to Guilford Rail System and renumbered to BM363 and 364. Guilford worked the units until 1996 when they were sold to UP. The units interestingly would keep their Guilford paint, with mediocre patch jobs, for another year until they were repainted and renumbered to 2742 and 2743. They kept these numbers until the early 2000s when they were renumbered to 1242 and 1243. UP would work them until 2013 when they were laid up at Roseville, California. Watco acquired the units later that year and repainted them both into the K&O livery. They still serve K&O today. WAMX 4001 was built in March of 1974 for Canadian National as Zebra Paint GP40-2LW number 9400. The 9400 would work for CN until the early 2000s when it was sold to Watco and renumbered to 4001. WAMX 4001 was first sent to work for the Stillwater Central Railroad in Oklahoma, where it served for several years with fellow CN Zebras. The unit was transferred from the SLWC to the K&O in 2011. K&O would work this at 4001 in its battered CN paint for another 3 years until the unit received a glamorous makeover into one of Kansas's most well-known locomotives, the WooShock unit. Now promoting the Wichita State University basketball team, the Shockers, the 4001 was a very eye-catching unit. It featured 2 WooShock logos on the nose and rear as well as a larger WooShock logo on the long hood, all accompanied by Go Shocks and WSU speed lettering. The 4001 would be put on display at the Great Plains Transportation Museum for Kansas Rail Fest later that year. The unit still works for the K&O today, and it even still wears its unique WSU livery. This unit was one of the first K&O units I saw when I first became a rail fan. WAMX 4008 was built in June of 1974 for Canadian National as GP40-2LW number 9447. CN worked with the 9447 until the mid-2000s when it was purchased by Watco. Watco renumbered it to 4008 and sent it to the Kansas and Oklahoma. It continued to work for K&O until 2014 when it received a proper K&O paint job. It was transferred to the Salina line that same year, although it did return to the south section within a few years. It has been laid up as of early 2024 due to mechanical issues, although it is back in service now. WAMX 4010 was built in June of 1974 for Canadian National as GP40-2LW number 9456. It worked faithfully for CN until 2005 when it was purchased by Watco and sent to Kansas. The unit retained its zebra paint even as the years went on. The K&O worked 4010 all across the system, although it tended to mostly stay around Great Bend. Come 2020, the unit was now battered and torn in its CN zebra paint, but the K&O chose not to repaint it. Even today, more than 50 years after it was built, it still retains its original CN zebra stripe paint job. It is the only WAMX GP40-2LW that still wears the CN paint scheme, and it is still operating today. WAMX 4024 was built in 1974 as Canadian National 9440. It served CN until 2005 when it was sold to Progress Rail. Watco acquired the unit soon after, and the unit would be spotted later that year along with 2 other former CN units, on a Union Pacific coal train headed east on the old Kansas Pacific main line. It would be delivered to South Kansas and Oklahoma several days later and placed into service. Watco would have the unit work for the SKOL until 2008, when it was repainted into the Watco livery and sent to the K&O. It never received K&O decals, and its whereabouts today are unknown. WAMX 4026 was built in June of 1974 as Canadian National 9462. CN worked the unit until 2005, when it was laid up and subsequently purchased by Progress Rail. Progress Rail nearly immediately sold it to Watco, and it was then renumbered to WAMX 4026. It worked uneventfully for the K&O for another 16 years until 2021, when the 4026 went through an interesting series of events. In June of 2021, 4026 was on the South Kansas and Oklahoma Railroad, heading to the Cherryvale shops for small repairs, when the unit was involved in a derailment east of Winfield, Kansas. The unit was sent to the Cherryvale shop for repairs following the accident. Interestingly, WAMX 4246, a former Southern Pacific SD40M-2 that had been requested for repaint a few months prior, was also on the SKOL at the time of the accident, though it was not involved in the accident, heading to the Cherryvale shop for repaint. However, SKOL decided to give the 4026 a fresh coat of K&O paint, as it was still in the CN paint scheme at the time, instead of the 4246, sending 4246 back to K&O in the same condition as before. The 4026 still works for K&O today, being one of just 2 locomotives wearing the new K&O livery with the K&O wheat logo on the long hood. WAMX 4029 was built in September of 1974 as CN 9501. It worked for CN in the zebra livery until 1994, when it received the new North America paint scheme. It continued to serve CN for 11 more years until it was finally retired in 2005 and sold to Progress Rail. Progress Rail didn't have their hands on the unit for long, as later that same year the unit would change hands again to Watco and would be renumbered a final time to 4029. The 4029 was sent via Union Pacific and SKOL to the Stillwater Central, where it resided for about 3 years, after which it was transferred to the Kansas and Oklahoma. It served K&O in its CN colors until 2017, when it received the K&O paint scheme. It was laid up in early 2024 following mechanical problems. WAMX 4031 was built in September of 1975 as CN 9625. The unit was originally painted in the zebra paint scheme, but received the North American scheme in 1995. It would serve the CN for 10 more years until it was sold off to Progress Rail and later Watco in 2005. Watco renumbered the unit to WAMX 4031 and sent it to work on the Kansas and Oklahoma. It received the K&O paint scheme in 2014 and was sent to the Salina line for work. It was transferred back south in 2015. It still works for the K&O today, and in March of 2024, it was one of 2 units that were chosen to haul the last Red Rock coal train that carried empty OGEX coal cars from Wichita, Kansas to Pratt, Kansas for storage. WAMX 4034 and 4035 were built in November of 1968 for the Penn Central as GP40s number 3229 and 3233. They served the Penn Central for 8 years until their absorption into Conrail in 1976. The units would retain their original PC number, although they did also receive a Conrail patch. The units lost their PC black in favor of Conrail blue in 1978. They would work for Conrail for 6 more years until they were sold to Guilford Rail System in 1984 and renumbered to BM 321 and 323. Guilford used the units in their Conrail blue until 1987, when they received the Guilford paint scheme. The 2 units worked for Guilford for 3 more years until they were sold off in 1990. The units were purchased by Amtrak, renumbered to Amtrak 658 and 659, and given the Phase 3 paint scheme. The units wouldn't last long on Amtrak, being sold off just 3 years after being added to the roster. The units would be purchased by Helm Leasing and would be rebuilt into GP40-3s, losing their Amtrak colors in the process in favor of the Helm livery. The units were soon renumbered from HLCX 658 and 659 to HLCX 4409 and 4410. The units would both be sent to the Canadian Pacific for leasing service. Following the termination of their lease to CP, the 4409 would be moved to Florida for storage, while the 4410 was sent to the Stillwater Central Railroad in Oklahoma. 4409 sat dormant for 8 years until finally hope arose. Watco purchased the units and sent them to Kansas. The units worked in their HLCX paint for 4 years on the K&O. Until 2012, they received the K&O paint job. The 2 units can often be found working together on various locals all throughout the south section of the K&O. 4035's Amtrak Red can even be seen starting to poke through the Watco Black. Both units are still operational today, and I myself have seen them many times. WAMX 4217 was built in April of 1969 for the Southern Pacific as SD45 number 9097. The unit would serve SP until the 1990s, when National Railway Equipment rebuilt the unit into an SD40M-2. In 1999, it would be repainted and renumbered to UP4747. It wouldn't have this number for too long, as just 2 years later in 2001, it would be renumbered to UP2797. Sadly, it wouldn't be around on the UP for too much longer, as it was removed from the UP roster and sold to CIT Group just weeks after being renumbered. Following the transformation to CEFX 2797, the unit would receive red, white, and white safety stripes on the nose for improved visibility. It would continue to work as a lease unit on the UP until 2008, when it was moved off the UP and placed into the general leasing pool, essentially meaning it would roam around on random railroads as a lease unit. In 2011, it was sold to Residco and given the designation OFOX 2797. It would continue to serve as a general lease unit until 2016, when it was purchased by Watco and renumbered to WAMX 4217. It was sent to the Kansas and Oklahoma's Newton line, where it still works today. WAMX 4218 was built in September of 1968 for the Southern Pacific as SD39 number 5308. 5308 would work for SP until October of 1995, when it was retired from the roster. It would be sold to NRE and would be rebuilt into an SD40M-2, now being UP4763. It would be renumbered to 2810 in 2001 and soon sold off to CEFX. It received the red and white safety stripes following the switch. It worked as a lease unit on Canadian Pacific and later CSX until 2015, when it was purchased by Watco and renumbered to WAMX 4218. It was sent to the Kansas and Oklahoma Newton line for service, where it still works today. It can often be found paired up with the 4217 on local runs, usually the BNSF interchange train. WAMX 4245 was built in January of 1968 as Southern Pacific SD45 number 9085. 9085 would serve the SP normally until 1995, when it was rebuilt into an SD40M-2 and renumbered to SP8590. It would also receive the SP speed lettering paint job. It worked for the SP and later UP until 2001, when it was renumbered to UP2683. 2683 worked for UP until 2010, when it was retired and sold to National Railway Equipment. It would be sent to Sterling, Illinois, where it would sit dormant for 4 years. It emerged from Sterling in December 2014, now with an NREX patch in preparation for release to CSX. 2683 wouldn't last long on CSX, as just 2 months after the lease began, 2683 was back on NRE property at Dixmoor, Illinois. In 2016, the unit would be revived again in preparation for the move to the Kansas and Oklahoma Railroad. NREX 2683 would work on the K&O under the NREX name until 2018, when it was purchased by Watco and renumbered to WAMX 4245. It would also get its SP lettering patched out in the process. It worked for the K&O and Southern Pacific Paint until 2021, when the locomotive would be sent to Cherryvale, Kansas to be repainted. It would emerge from the SKOL shops early in the summer of 2021, now wearing the new K&O paint scheme featuring the K&O wheat logo on the long blade. It still serves the K&O today, often paired up with the final unit. WAMX 4246 was built in March of 1971 for the Kansas City Southern as KCS SD40 number 629. 629 would work for the KCS until the late 1980s, when it was retired. In 1993, KCS would sell the 629 to Morrison Knudsen, who would forward the unit to Southern Pacific to be rebuilt into an SD40M-2. Following the rebuild, it would be gifted the Southern Pacific speed lettering scheme and a new number, 8639. 8639 worked for the SP and later UP under that number until 1998, when it was renumbered to UP2715. 2715 worked for UP until 2009, when it was retired and placed into storage at Inglewood Yard in Houston, Texas. It was moved out of the deadline in 2010 and back into storage at National Railway Equipment's Sterling, Illinois facility. It lay dormant for 4 years until 2014, when it was given an NREX patch in preparation for release to CSX. It worked on various trains all across CSX for a few more months, being present in many strange consists during that time. In 2016, it was moved off of CSX and onto the Kansas and Oklahoma for long-term lease. In 2018, 2715 would be purchased by Watco and renumbered to WAMX 4246. The locomotive worked around the Wichita area for 3 years on all kinds of locals, usually paired up with 4245s. In 2021, following 4245's return from Cherryvale with a fresh K&O scheme, the 4246 was sent onto the SKOL to get the Watco treatment as well. It seemed as though the loved Southern Pacific speed lettering SD40M-2 would finally be losing its original paint. Except that's not what happened. If you remember from earlier how the 4026 and 4246 were on the SKOL at the same time, but the 4026 was chosen for repaint instead, then you will probably understand this as well. Following the repainting of the 4026, the Cherryvale shop ran out of money for paint and was not able to repaint the 4246. Knowing that they wouldn't be able to repaint the unit even partially, the shop members decided to just send the unit back to K&O. It returned a week after its departure from Wichita in the same condition it left in, much to the delight of railfans. It served the K&O for a little less than 3 more years, often paired up with 4245 on interchange jobs, delighting the Wichita railfans. However, things couldn't last forever, as in April 12, 2024, 4246 was spotted trailing on an SKOL train headed out of Wichita. It was first assumed that it was headed to Cherryville for repaint, but that wasn't the case. It was headed to the Stillwater Central. Myself and many other rail fans were very upset by this, as we are losing our favorite K&O unit. However, Watco would please us again, as just 1 month later it returned to the K&O, where it still works today, trying its best to cope with the elements and keep its SP paint showing proudly. I hope that myself and my friends are able to see it many more times in the future. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe to see more exciting catches and rail fanning content from all over Kansas. Comment down below what your favorite K&O locomotive is.